Hello and welcome to another episode of Pittsburgh Sports Memories. On this episode, we'll be covering the Cordell Stewart "Don't Call Me Slash" era of the Steelers. My name is Steve Wirt, and I'm with.
I'm Tim Hannon.
And as usual, we're going to cover a Pittsburgh sports memory blast from the past. This one might be a little controversial. We probably have some differing opinions on Cordell here, but it should be fun, and it's always fun. This topic has been covered a little bit, but we haven't covered it, so it isn't covered until we've covered it. We'll have the final word here on Cordell.
Get rid of the ball, Cordell.
Yeah.
Anytime I hear Cordell Stewart's name, I just think of fans yelling at him.
Poor Cordell. But Cordell, he left a complicated legacy. He really started off like really excited, and I think kind of captured the imagination of fans. So to kind of set that all up, in '94, Cordell had a successful college career. He went to the University of Colorado. He won a couple bowl games, and even in Colorado, he set many passing records: passes completed, most passing yards, and touchdown passes. Probably his most memorable moment in college was throwing a Hail Mary against Michigan at the end of the game to win. I think Michael Westbrook caught it.
Yeah.
Ray Caruth was on the field too. Prior his prison. I think Ray Caruth's out of prison. I think he got parole.
Okay.
Believe it or not.
I can't tell you the answer to that,
But
definitely that was like his big moment, and that's the reason I had heard of Cordell Stewart was because of that play.
And it was a big pass. It was like a 75-yard pass. It wasn't, it was kind of lucky. It bounced off like another receiver and went in the end zone. And Ty Law kind of aided on that. Like he tackled Westbrook in the end zone after he caught the pass. So great job, Ty Law.
But just Cordell getting into the end zone, I think that's the thing that, there's a lot of Hail Marys in football, and they're just, like you said, sometimes they're just lucky. But the fact that he threw it from where he threw it, I think that's what really got people's attention.
Yeah. But in general, the offense they ran in Colorado under Coach Bill McCartney was an option one, so there wasn't a terrible amount of passing, and it was more based on running the ball. And going into the draft, Cordell did not want to switch positions like some other players that we'll discuss later in the podcast. He wanted to play quarterback, and some teams wanted him to switch positions because he was he was a very athletic player, but Cordell really wanted to play quarterback, and that's where he saw his future lying. So that did hurt his draft status a little bit, his insistence on playing quarterback.
And remember, Steve, this was the era of Major Harris and Tony Rice and who else? Charlie Ward, Tommy Frazier at Nebraska.
Yeah, there was a lot of quarterbacks who didn't make it in the NFL. I think too the NFL was so different. The rules were very different. We'll discuss that later too.
Right.
Like in the offenses were different. Like it was a lot of different. The quarterback, the prototypical quarterback, if I can say that, is probably Troy Aikman. I would say the guy who kind of stands in the pocket and throws a pass. So it's a little different than what it's kind of become.
And I remember that being said about some of those other guys I mentioned too. Like, well, they definitely can't play quarterback in the NFL, but maybe they could play some other position. They could play safety, or they could play wide receiver, or whatever.
And Charlie Ward actually had a successful NBA career.
Right.
So,
right.
Figure.
But it was just assumed that if you were a running quarterback in college, you had no chance in the NFL.
Right. Especially back then.
Right.
Yeah. Early in so he follows the Steelers with the 60th pick in the second round of the NFL draft of '95. I remember even then there was some excitement. I remember people were pretty excited about the Steelers drafting him. I thought he went in the later round, but no, he went in the second round. So, not a first-round pick, but still second round, still a pretty decently high pick. Early, so in his '95 season, after the preseason, he actually found himself as the fourth-string quarterback, and they kept 4 quarterbacks that year, and it's kind of a weird year because the Steelers had like all these guys would become starters in the NFL, and they would all make the playoffs and all have at least one very successful year in the NFL. And those players were Neil O'Donnell, Mike Tomczak, and Jim Miller. Neil O'Donnell had been there, 3 or 4 years. Tomczak was a longtime veteran. We'll discuss him a little later. And Jim Miller was a second-year rookie. So, Jim Miller was still kind of a rookie, and Cordell was kind of this, other guy. And they didn't want to let him go since he was a second-round pick. And I guess they didn't want to get rid of Jim Miller, so they just kind of kept Cordell. And he really didn't see the field for half the season because of these other 3 quarterbacks. And I remember we've discussed this game before, I think, in other podcasts. The Super Bowl 30 podcast was the Cincinnati game that we attended, and Cordell played wide receiver that game, and Neil O'Donnell just wouldn't throw him the ball for whatever reason because he was open in the middle of the field, and he wouldn't throw him the ball, or I don't know what O'Donnell was doing, but the Steelers ended up losing the game, and the Steelers ended up kind of getting a little desperate after that game, and they were moving Cardell Lake around in position. So I think they decided they needed a little bit more on offense, and they started to move Cordell around, and they kind of like, we have this guy who's really talented. We need to get him involved in the offense. So against Cleveland, he had an amazing touchdown. This is like one of the highlights of that season where he runs all the way to the right, and then he like fakes out a defender, runs all the way back to the other side, and throws a touchdown pass to Ernie Mills. It was one of the highlights of his early career, and I think that really got people excited. Later in the season against Cincinnati again, I guess Cincinnati decided to play the same defense. Cordell was wide open. The Steelers were actually down by, I think, 2 touchdowns, and they came back and scored 35 unanswered points and actually won that game. But Cordell had a big touchdown pass for 71 yards. The coaching staff put him in at running back. He had a nice 22-yard run against the Patriots in Week 16. I'm not sure the Patriots were a playoff team that year. Was that 95? Yeah, they were. I think
they were okay, I think.
Yeah, they were getting better. Yeah, they were definitely.
Because they made the Super Bowl the following year, so I don't think they were terrible.
Yeah, and they had Curtis Martin, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So in a playoff game against Buffalo, he started punting. So they put him in a punter, and they did a punt to pin the Bills back. So that was in the playoffs. And then the playoffs, he had the famous touchdown in the AFC Championship game right before the half that kind of kept the Steelers in it because the Steelers had a really bad half. But he had stepped out of bounds and come back in, and the referees missed it, but they didn't have instant replay back then. And so the Steelers kind of got a gift touchdown there at the end of the half. Big thing with Cordell in his first season, he became this fan favorite because I guess, it was kind of he's a popular player. He's easy to spot. He's making a lot of plays. And he kind of captured people's imagination with, because this was something new to the NFL, a real athletic person playing quarterback, And Myron Cope gave him the nickname Slash because he played so many different positions. Quarterback / wide receiver / running back / punter. Stewart did play in Super Bowl 30. He had 4 rushes for 15 yards. And spoiler alert, it would be the only Super Bowl that Cordell would ever play in. And he didn't really do that much in the Super Bowl, which is kind of weird because I think Ernie Mills ended up getting hurt in that game. You think Cordell would have been more focused on, but Neil O'Donnell was too busy throwing the ball to Larry Brown.
Yeah, the Steelers had bigger problems in that game.
Yeah. He lost out on Rookie of the Year to some guy named Curtis Martin. Curtis Martin had a really good rookie season, even though Bill Parcells, after his first game, called him a one-game wonder. But I think that was just some motivational head games Parcells liked to play.
Yeah, his first year, it's hard to understate the excitement. He was just this utility. He can do anything kind of player, and you're right. The fans just loved every time he came on the field. You'd want to Where's Cordell lining up? What are they going to do? Are they going to run a reverse to them? Are they going to have him go out for a pass? Is he going to punt the ball? Like, he could do anything when he was on the field.
And I think the media played into it too. The media got a lot of hype. I remember they had like a little graphic, like it was like old '90s like computer graphic. Like they would like click on it and like it would be like open up and it'd be like, oh, and here's all his different positions. So the media kind of played into it too. So it wasn't like Cordell was seeking this. And then he got commercial deals. I guess if you go on our website, you'll be able to check them out. One was with Nike, which is pretty funny because the late Jerry Stiller, I think, was one of the funnier actors on Seinfeld, plays Vince Lombardi, and he basically like if Frank Costanza could be Vince Lombardi, that's basically how it plays out.
Yeah.
But it's pretty funny.
It is pretty funny.
And then he did another commercial with him and Bill Cowher, and that was another Nike commercial. So, I mean, Cordell had a pretty successful rookie season, even though he was like basically didn't start the season, was, kind of inactive. And a lot of those, practice squad guys don't see much. He actually, kind of came off the practice squad. So, in '96 season, the Steelers changed offensive coordinators. They go to a guy named Chan Gailey. Ron Earhart left to coach the Jets, and he took Neil O'Donnell with him.
That worked out well.
Yeah, for both of them, for sure. Before the season, there is a QB competition between Jim Miller, Mike Tomczak, and Cordell Stewart. Jim Miller had been drafted by the Steelers in '94. He was from Michigan State. He'd played in NFL Europe. He got hurt, but he had some success for the Frankfurt Galaxy, if anybody was a big NFL Europe fan.
I love the Galaxy.
Yeah. And he was heading into his third season with the Steelers. Mike Tomczak was a journeyman quarterback. He was in '96. He had spent most of his career with the Chicago Bears. He'd been with a couple other teams, but his most memorable stop was with the Bears. He was actually in the Super Bowl Shuffle video with the rest of the '85 Bears, believe it or not. Cordell was, of course, in his second year after a highly successful rookie year. Some other stuff that kind of happened that, some background that year. Bam Morris, the running back from the year before, got arrested for having, I don't know, I never could find the exact amount. They said between 5 and 50 pounds of marijuana in his trunk. So he was kind of out of the picture. He did some time in prison. And probably one of the biggest trades in team history happened. They brought Jerome Bettis in to help out the offense. So at the end of preseason, Cowher picks Jim Miller over Tomczak and Stewart in what Cowher called a gut decision. Cowher's exact quote was, "It was hard to pinpoint. I don't know that there was a clear winner."
I remember that preseason. They're playing the Eagles, and Cordell is playing at the very end of the game, and he actually throws, again, like a 70-yard Hail Mary that's caught on like the 8-yard line. And then the next play, they punch it into the end zone. So I don't remember if Cordell outplayed those other two guys in the preseason. Obviously, Cowher didn't think so. But I remember he was still capable of making these like exciting plays. And of all the preseason games, I don't remember too many preseason games, but I remember that one, him throwing that like really super long Hail Mary against the Eagles.
Yeah, and it's kind of, I don't know if Jim Miller was kind of a safe choice or, I'm not quite.
Well, I think they thought, Cowher had two options. You could go with the journeyman and play it safe. You could say, like, okay, we're the defending AFC champions. This is still a good team. Let's keep things sort of going now that we lost our quarterback. Let's go with the veteran. Or, you know what, one of these two guys, Miller or Cordell, is the quarterback of the future. Let's put him in now and start the future now. So I think that's where his head was, but I'm sure you'll get to this here in a minute.
It was a gut decision.
His head didn't stay there very long.
Which I just think was Phil Cowher saying, "I'm not going to tell you why I made a decision,
right?
Because I don't want to give it away or be held responsible for it later."
Right. Well, and maybe it was just a gut. Maybe he just didn't have, like, sometimes you just have to do that in life. You just weigh all the evidence.
There's no clear cut. It's
right.
Not like a no-brainer.
Right.
Yeah. I remember a PG article before the season starting, declaring it was Miller time and endorsing Jim Miller. I could not find that article. I think it was Ron Cook. I'm pretty sure it was Ron Cook. But I just remember my dad just like the whole because they go to Jacksonville and the whole time, it's Miller time. Like my dad just thought that was so funny. But so the first game of the season, really, the Steelers really stink. They stink it up. They go to Florida, and all three quarterbacks end up playing. The offense looks horrible. Nobody really looked good. He kind of rotated everybody. The offense just kind of looked in shambles. Like, quite honestly, there was nothing to the offense. So after the game, like you said, Cowher eventually goes to the journeyman QB in Mike Tomczak. And Mike Tomczak ends up starting the rest of the season in the one playoff game. Mike Tomczak did play well at times, but there were times he would scare me. Like he got to like the Bubby Brister where like, oh my God, he's going to throw an interception every time he dropped back. So Tomczak, in that season he had 15 touchdowns and 17 interceptions, which is bad.
And he probably had like 20 more, like the ball
Almost,
hit the defender in the arm. Yeah.
Yeah. Stewart had a nice 80-yard run against Carolina, but the Steelers still lost that game. That was kind of like a highlight of his career. They keep Cordell. They keep him as a slash role, and that was Chan Gailey. Chan Gailey ended up being a really good coordinator and a pretty good head coach, I always thought. And he kind of knew how to like work with Cordell for some reason. Like he knew how to use him. So he does throw 30 passes, but he only has 11 completions that year. No touchdown passes that year. He does much better running the ball. He has 5 TDs rushing with 171 yards. The Steelers finished the season at 10-6. They beat the Colts in the wild card game, 42-14. Cordell has 2 rushing touchdowns and a pass completion, so a pretty successful game. They kind of blow the Colts out. I just remember that game. They hyped it. They kept showing highlights of the Jim Harbaugh pass that fell incomplete, and it was like a wild card game, and they were just trying to hype, and it ended up being just a blowout. Because the Colts, number one, the Steelers always beat the Colts, and number 2, the Colts weren't that great that year. The next week, and I remember watching this game with at least part of this game with our producer Dave. There was a heavy fog. Like if they would have played this game today, they probably would have postponed it. They probably would not have played this game. But there was they were calling the Fog Bowl too. And once again, the Patriots had Curtis Martin and a pretty good team. And I think Parcells was the head coach. So pretty good team. And they would go and just absolutely torch the Steelers. 23-9 was the final score. Curtis Martin had 166 yards and 3 TDs rushing. The Patriots would go on to play in the Super Bowl that year, losing to the Packers. So the Patriots were pretty good that year. In the divisional playoff game, the one against the Patriots, Cordell would attempt 10 passes and not complete even one of them, and he was only able to rush for 19 yards. And I think that's kind of like starting to foreshadow like when he plays against better defenses, his play kind of declines. And that would be kind of one of the themes of his career. They switched out Stewart and Tomczak a lot at quarterback this game. I guess they were trying to, the offense was struggling, and it really didn't work. I just remember, I think Rod Woodson got juked out by Curtis Martin one time on one of the long runs early in the game. So, yeah, it was a pretty ugly and a forgettable playoff game for Cordell and the Steelers in general. I didn't even watch all of it. I think I watched maybe half of it.
Yeah, it was like over by halftime.
Yeah.
And that I mean, that the Mike Tomczak experiment kind of went how you expected it. Like Tomczak had a safe floor, so they won 10 games that year with Tomczak as a starter. He was 10-5 as a starter, but then his ceiling was not very high. And so you get into a playoff game and the defense gives up some big plays, and Mike Tomczak's not the guy that can bring them back. Mike Tomczak was like the game manager. He could, maybe carry you forward, although he also threw a lot of interceptions, so that's not really that good of a game manager either. But that
he
was
would
the
make
whole
some
experiment.
plays though sometimes too, though. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I don't want to try.
Yeah.
I mean, again, he had a fairly. Again, they won the division that year. They made it to the second round of the playoffs. But you weren't going to beat the elite teams in the conference or win the Super Bowl unless you had a really, really good defense. Like they had Jerome Bettis had a really good season that year, so that was really their whole offense was Bettis.
Running the ball, yeah, and I think that goes on for like a couple more years, yeah.
And their defense just wasn't the same as it had been like 2 or 3 years
Well,
earlier.
that really was like the end of Rod Woodson, like
Right.
being really a dominant corner. Like it took another year at San Francisco and Baltimore for him to figure that out. But
That was it. The Patriots game was his last game as a Steeler, and you're right. He was definitely done. He was no longer the Hall of Fame shutdown corner, and it just he had the injury the year earlier. So yeah, without an elite, I think Tomczak could have led them back to the Super Bowl if the defense still would have been elite, but it wasn't. And so yeah, now you head into the next season. Now what do you do?
yeah. So going into '97, the Steelers do a curious thing. They just kind of hand the job to Cordell Stewart. The front office and Bill Cowher just, Donahoe and this is our guy. So they actually cut Jim Miller. So they get rid of the young competition. They do keep Tomczak, but they just name Cordell the starter. They just like, okay, going in the season, he's the starter. There's no competition or anything like that. And in '97, they're kind of rewarded. Stewart has a pretty successful year, quite honestly, and he had some great games that year. I remember the Week 15 game against Denver. Stewart had 3 touchdown passes and 2 rushing touchdowns, and the Steelers beat the Denver was really probably the second best team or the best team in the AFC. It was kind of neck and neck, I thought, that year between them and Denver. And of course, Dallas was really probably the best team in the NFL still at that point, or maybe it was Green. Well, Green Bay won the Super Bowl that year.
Yeah.
The year before.
Yeah, Green Bay and San Francisco, but in the AFC, right? It was
Yeah.
basically Denver, Kansas City, and Pittsburgh. New England was up there too. So you had some powerhouse teams in the AFC, but when they played Denver in Week 15, that was like you said, that was
Well, they had Terrell Davis, and Elway was at the end of his career,
Right.
but yeah, Elway was still pretty good. He could still make some plays and stuff. It was a really great, accurate passing against that. Like that was probably one of Cordell's better passing games, But once again, like Denver kind of played like a man defense, and that's another thing we'll get into later. Like it's kind of one of like Cordell's weaknesses. So
it was they definitely the Denver defense could not handle him that game, and I remember the final touchdown that he scored. The Steelers were up by I think 4 or something like that. Denver was trying to hold them to a field goal so that they could get the ball back and have a chance to still be within 1 score. And it was 3rd down, and Denver was prepared for Stewart to pass. So they were playing like a pass defense, and
I think
called
he
a
ran.
draw play.
Yeah, and he ran. Yeah.
They like an intentional he takes like 1 step back.
That's
and
a tough play to stop because,
Right.
and that's so effective in college because, like all the defenders drop off in zone to cover people, and it kind of like opens up the middle of the field, and the defenders that are rushing go to the outside, and it leaves basically if you have a really good running quarterback 1-on-1 with a nose tackle, like you're probably going to win that 9 times out of 10.
Right, and it was just
yeah.
you could see Denver just had no answer. Like, okay, we're ready for him to pass now, and then he'd run. Okay, we're ready for him to run now, then he'd pass. It was just he just picked them apart, and when they won that game, and then especially after the next week, which I know you're going to talk about next, I thought that was going to be our 5th Super Bowl that year. I really did.
Yeah, he had a great game against New England. Let me see, did I? Yeah, I did. I didn't really cover New England too much, but that was a big game. He completed a 4th down pass to that Thigpen where he like barely kept his feet in.
Right.
And then I know he completed like a touchdown late in the game, and that was the infamous Kevin Henry.
Right. They were down by 8 points, and
yeah.
he had I think he converted. So what had happened was Drew Bledsoe threw
a bad interception.
a really bad interception.
Yeah, to Kevin Henry.
Kevin Henry was a defensive lineman.
Which I yelled, run.
Yeah,
person
Steve
with
yelled some obscenities.
Yeah, it was like because
we
he
were
was just
watching that
Kevin
game.
Henry was like big and slow, and like
Yeah.
it really wasn't his job to pick off passes.
No.
But Drew Bledsoe just saw him, and hey, he's wide open.
But even
wait
after,
a minute,
even after Drew Bledsoe made that mistake, Cordell still had to convert a 4th down and a 2-point conversion,
Yeah.
and drove them down the field to win in overtime.
yeah, and he like made some really like that pass on 4th down. Well, the catch more than because the pass was out of bounds, but the guy caught it, and I want to say it was Thigpen, or maybe it was Hastings.
Well,
And he caught it, and he tapped his feet just barely.
right, and that game was at Foxborough.
Yeah, if they lose that game, they would have gone back to Foxborough.
for the playoffs.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So, and another thing that had been happening is like whenever the Steelers got like short yardage down by the goal line, like they would just call QB sneak. And even like 4th and 1, like it was totally unstoppable that year. Like you said, it was just like nobody could stop it.
Yeah, it's very similar. Honestly, I think it's very similar to the season that Lamar Jackson had in 2019 for the Ravens. I don't know if Cordell was quite that dominant. He wasn't like the league MVP, but it was very similar to where, or even Michael Vick, his first really good season, or RG3, his first really good season. Like just teams had no answer. They didn't know how to do it, and especially back then.
Yeah.
Because back then you never.
Well, I think the linebackers were so much bigger, and like they weren't meant like Levon Kirkland was a freak. He was that big and could cover people, but like he was the exception, not the rule. Most people were linebackers were Levon Kirkland size or smaller and couldn't run with anybody.
It just was different than what the NFL had ever seen before, and that in college football you saw offenses like that all the time, but not in the NFL, and nobody was prepared for it. And again, it really felt like the Steelers, were going to potentially win a Super Bowl.
So they do 11. They get 11-5, which actually better than the year before, and they play the divisional game. And this game. I remember this game so distinctly. They had to play New England again here, but New England had like a ton of injuries. Like I remember that too. Like New England really didn't have much on offense that game. It was like Drew Bledsoe. That was it. And I think they had Ben Coates, but I think even Ben Coates got hurt during the game, and they didn't even have him for the second half. And Parcells was not the coach that year.
That was Pete Carroll.
Was Pete Carroll, yeah. So they had Cordell had a rushing like a long 30-yard as run or something early in the game. I remember that.
It was really early in the game. He ran down the left sideline.
Yeah.
And he kind of turned around and was like kind of holding his arm up in the air as he's running into the end zone, looking at the ref because he was right on the white. On the sideline, and he wasn't sure if he stepped out of bounds or not, and nobody from the defense was anywhere near him.
Yeah.
So he wasn't sure if they thought he stepped out of bounds, but it was a touchdown, and then ended up being the only touchdown of the game.
Yeah, and it was 7, and then New England did kick 2 field goals with Vinatieri, and Vinatieri actually missed a field goal. I think.
Did he? Okay.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah, because I remember. I think your brother said, there's the AFC Pro Bowl kicker, or something like that, and then. And this was just like a white knuckle ride. I just remember oh my gosh, you were like hanging on for dear life, and Cordell got stuffed on the goal line. Like they called a QB sneak on 4th and goal from like the 1 that would have put the game away pretty much, and New England stuffed it. And but they end up winning 7-6 in one of the most stressful playoff wins ever, and another fun fact is this is the only time the Steelers have beaten the Patriots in the playoffs. That's hard to believe. Yeah, that was way back in '98. Yeah.
Yeah, I was at that game, and all I remember is thinking, I can't believe we won a playoff game by the score of 7-6. Like, what a crazy score for a playoff game. But that put the Steelers in the AFC Championship game.
Yeah, and it was a rematch with Denver.
At Three Rivers.
Yeah, at home. They'd beaten Denver, and you think, well, they should at least make the Super Bowl. They can beat Denver. But Denver figures out, what they made. It's always tough to beat a team twice in one season, and Denver was definitely good enough to figure that out, especially on defense. Stewart did complete the same amount of passes as John Elway did, 18, but John Elway didn't throw 3 interceptions. And I think Norm Johnson missed a couple field goals too. And he really only threw 1 late touchdown. And people probably, he almost brought him back. No, he did. I always thought that was more of like garbage time touchdown. And then they would, they kicked off and they converted Denver converted a 3rd down against Kirkland. Shannon Sharp pushed off Kirkland, but I don't know. I don't think there was much. The defense, wouldn't have had to make that stop if Cordell just doesn't turn the ball over even like, twice. If he just only turns over once instead of 3 times, But
Yeah, the thing that so the Steelers were actually winning that game at one point 14-7, and I think it was 14-10 when Cordell threw his first interception, and it was like they had the ball in Denver territory, and he tried to.
And that was where Romanowski pointed at his head and stuff. Like,
Yeah, Bill Romanowski was a linebacker for the Broncos, and he did this like slapped his head like, "What are you, stupid?" at Cordell, and that was sort of the memorable image from that game. But the Steelers were winning; they had all the momentum, and Cordell threw an interception in their territory, and I just remember that turned the whole game around, and then Denver started to score points. And you're right.
I think Elway completed some passes at the end of the half. They had some questionable pass interference calls.
They did.
But that's when you're playing, you got to be. Sometimes you got to overcome refs' calls like that. So
it was 24-14 at the half, and Stewart made a big turnover in the third quarter when they got deep into Denver territory. And then, like you said, he scored a late touchdown to make it 24-21. And then Sharp converted the third down, but it was too little too late at that point. So, I mean, it wasn't like Cordell single-handedly lost the game. The defense gave up a bunch of points. They didn't play as well. But all the magic, that was the magic of that season. Like, Cordell could bring them back if they were down.
I think, too, once they got so far behind, they kind of took Bettis out of the game, which, once again, that was, kind of like Bettis was definitely, I didn't put his stat because this is about Cordell, and I'm sure at some point we'll go over the '98 season in more detail on our other podcast. But
it was a disappointing loss though, and man, it was disappointing. But I don't know, how did you feel after that game, Steve? Because I kind of felt like, okay, that stinks. Cordell didn't have a great game.
I figured there would be many great years. Yes. I thought that was the beginning of another. Oh well, we're gonna have this guy's young. We still got a pretty good team. Right. We can, So I mean, I thought for years to come, we would be, at least in the playoffs, if not in the mix, to at least make it to the Super Bowl.
In the 1970s, the Steelers lost the '72 AFC Championship game to the Dolphins before they went on to win 4 Super Bowls. Sometimes your first, the first young team out there isn't going to do it, but then it's like you said, the start of something.
Unfortunately, this was actually the end. I think. Denver went on to win the Super Bowl over Green Bay. That was the first time the AFC had won a Super Bowl since 1983. Like I said, this is one of the more disappointing losses in team history, and it stung at the time. But boy, you didn't realize that was going to be. Stewart finished the season with 3,000 passing yards and 21 touchdowns overall, but he did throw 17 interceptions. But with Cordell, you always have to factor in there was always Steigerwald and some of the other people that were Cordell kind of defenders. I remember John Steigerwald was a big Cordell defender. You got to figure in his rushing touchdowns. It's okay, that's great, but so even if you do 11 plus 21 is what, 23, and 17 interceptions and then 6 fumbles. So you better figure in his fumbles too. So that's even. So he's even for the year. You're supposed to have a touchdown to interception ratio of 3-1. That's considered a successful quarterback, and he wasn't even at 2-1.
I think we talked about Mike Tomczak turning the ball over a ton the year before that, and I think we could overlook it at the time because Cordell could make up for it by making some big dynamic play, like that run I talked about against the Broncos in the regular season. Yeah. Mike Tomczak couldn't do that.
There was a 4th down run too in that game, I think too. And
that's what I mean. So I think that's why it was sort of easy to overlook the turnovers because, okay, he's going to have turnovers, but look what he can do. Look what he can do. And we never had this at that point.
We'd always had the Neil O'Donnell, Bubby Brister. Mike
Tomczak. I mean, people were starving for good. We had not had a good quarterback
since Bradshaw.
And so it was hey, we finally have a star quarterback. It's the first time, so I think that's why I think it was easy to overlook things.
So heading into the '98 season, I think this is when and that would be just to preface this, and this is kind of a spoiler alert for the next couple seasons, is that would be the last playoff appearance for Stewart and the Steelers in the '90s, and that was 1998. the winter of '98, right?
Yeah, it was the '97 season.
Yeah. So the '98 season, this starts another to start. Chan Gailey leaves as offensive coordinator. I think he was head coach. Did he go head coach at Dallas? Yeah. And in one of the weirder episodes in team history, Cowher likes Cordell so much he lets him interview candidates for offensive coordinator. So Cordell basically hires his own coordinator, a gentleman named Ray Sherman. Sherman was a quarterback coach with the Minnesota Vikings. According to Bob Labriola from a Steelers Q&A article, Sherman was so over his head that season that he called a play from the Vikings playbook during a game in November.
Oh, wow.
So, and another fun fact about Ray Sherman is when Daryl Drake died in 2019, suddenly, they actually brought Sherman back. And as of 2020, Ray Sherman's still the wide receivers coach. So, kind of nice little symmetry for Ray Sherman. He's still out there being he's just, better position coach maybe than offensive coordinator.
Yes.
But good for Ray Sherman for hanging in there.
But it was definitely a disaster.
Yeah, I mean,
with him being the offensive coordinator.
Yeah, and then too, we covered this before in the 2000 broadcast. Turmoil in the front office between Cowher and Donahoe starts. We're letting a lot of players go. We're not signing anybody, and then the draft wasn't maybe as good. But even when you draft a player, it takes 2 or 3 years. So the losses in free agency weren't being able to be made up by the people in the draft quick enough.
Yes.
So, I mean, the '98 draft did yield Deshae Townsend, Hines Ward, and Alan Faneca. 2 of those guys are probably going to be in the Hall of Fame. So, I mean, that's not a horrible draft. Actually, that's actually a pretty darn good draft. But it just took, it took Hines Ward 3 years to develop, and Townsend, I would say, a year or two, too. So, the season also started a trend where the Steelers would start strong but fade into the second half of the season. The Tampa, there was a game in Tampa where Cordell only completed 9 passes and he threw 3 interceptions. So he was benched and they brought Tom Zach back in, and the cameras captured him crying on the sidelines. And I think that's where fans kind of had started to lose faith in Cordell.
That was such a turning point.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I don't know how that plays out today. I just know in 1998 that played out very poorly, and fans just, it was amazing too. Because,
well, it wasn't it was and it's I think it just showed a lack of you have to be a little bit more mature sometimes, and just there was some immaturity, I think.
Well, I mean, and he was very emotionally crying too, and there's nothing wrong with crying, certainly, but I think, like you said, was he crying because he got benched?
Well, hold it. Yeah, I mean, I would say at least hold it together till you get by. You're not on camera. Don't do that on camera and in front of your team. That's especially when you're a team leader.
Right.
Yeah. This is much different than Hines Ward crying because, man, we lost the game, and it's after the game, and it was in front of the media.
Yeah.
It was different. It was he cared so much for his teammate, and he wanted to win for Jerome. This was woe is me, and
Dick Vermeil, the coach of the Rams, he cried all the time, pretty much every press conference. Like I said, I think you're right. I think and whether it's right or wrong, I think that football fans saw it and probably still would see it today as, why are you crying? And what's the scenario? What's the situation?
There's no crying in football. If Tom Hanks was coaching.
Getting benched. You're crying because you got benched, and it definitely shows he couldn't handle somebody telling him he wasn't good enough to stay in the game, was how it came across.
Yeah. So the Steelers had a 7-4 record heading into Week 13, and they lost the last 5 games and went 7-9. And that was another fun part of the season. Is if this happens and the Steelers win, and teams like A, B, and C win, lose, or tie, it was they're not good enough to make the playoffs. And that was the first time they'd missed the playoffs in Bill Cowher's coaching tenure.
Yeah, it was shocking, especially like you said, they were 7-4. All they had to do is win probably 2 of those last 5 games, and they probably still would have been in, or at least close to it. But they just dropped them all, and so it all went downhill real fast.
Yeah, and Cordell's stats for that year, he had 2,560 yards. He had 11 touchdowns passing, but he threw 18 interceptions. There's the interceptions, the turnovers. He had 406 yards rushing and 2 touchdowns, but he had 3 fumbles. So he had 21 turnovers total again. It was definitely a drop-off from the previous year. So Ray Sherman is let go after 1 season. But Ray, don't be too upset for Ray Sherman. He landed right on his feet, coached for many more years, and is still coaching. Yeah, so good for him.
Yeah, and it's hard to say whether, like, Ray Sherman's offense, contributed to the drop-off, or whether Cordell's bad play contributed to Ray Sherman looking like a failure. You know what I mean? Like, it's hard to say.
Chicken or the egg kind of argument.
Right.
Yeah.
And you could also argue that, again, in 1997, teams had no answer for Cordell. And maybe in 1998, they'd figured some things out.
Yeah.
I mean, you can go back and look at other quarterbacks who had similar sort of paths where they came in, they were on fire. You can look at Colin Kaepernick. You can look at RG3. Like these freak athletic quarterbacks just took the league by storm, and then there was a drop off the second season, the third season, whatever. Mm-hmm. And that wasn't true for everybody. Michael Vick he outlasted that for a few years.
Yeah, we'll cover that a little more later. I have like a whole section on that. So maybe we
I'll
don't
hold
want
my thoughts there.
Yeah, maybe we don't want to give that all away right now. We'll finish up Cordell's career here.
Okay.
But that'll make for some good. Yeah, I have some good comparisons. Maybe not as good as some of those, but I do have some other people, and historically too. So something to look forward to. In '99, they this time didn't let Cordell hire his own offensive coordinator, and they actually hired like a guy who's very successful and would be successful after a stint in Pittsburgh, and that was Kevin Gilbride. Now, Kevin Gilbride is a personality, and he's a little bit abrasive, and his most famous thing, besides like he had a great offense in Houston with Warren Moon, he got punched by Buddy Ryan during a Jets game. Because Buddy Ryan's defense was giving up points, and I guess Gilbride let him know about it, and Buddy Ryan doesn't put up with that crap. He fought Mike Ditka. Do you think he's not going to like fight like Kevin Gilbride? Like Gilbride's definitely a step down in class for Buddy Ryan there. If he's going to like pick a fight with like ex-NFL tight end and generally tough guy Mike Ditka, I don't think Gilbride's going to be that big of a problem.
Yeah, that was bizarre to see the offensive coordinator and defensive coordinator getting into a fist fight on national television.
But Gilbride has been like the things I've read about. He does have a little bit of an attitude and stuff, but he's a good offensive coordinator, and he's had success before. It's not like Ray Sherman where he didn't really have success, was thrown in the deep. This guy's had success. He's dealt with personalities. He knows what he's doing. So, but now Cordell's now had 3 offensive coordinators in 3 seasons. And the Steelers start off strong, beating Cleveland. The New Browns, that was their first game back. It was 43-0. The New Browns were pretty horrible, have been horrible for a long time. Since then, Cordell had a TD passing, a TD rushing, and no interceptions. So it had a pretty solid opening, but like I said, Cleveland was a really bad team that year. Cordell had a 3-interception game against a decent Seattle team. I remember that because Seattle, like in the defense, had definitely fallen off. I just remember the announcers, I don't know, it was Randy Cosgrove or just gloating, just like the home field advantage is over, and like just like so excited that Seattle was blowing like the Steelers out. It was like, but Cordell had a pretty bad game, and the defense wasn't that great either. Cordell had a decent game against the Bills with 2 touchdowns and an interception, but he got outplayed by Doug Flutie. Once again, they're 5-3 heading into Week 10, and then they lose to Cleveland. It was really bad that year, and that was 16-15. Cordell threw 2 interceptions, and this kind of like started a really bad losing streak, and they lost 7 of their last 8 games, and they went 6-10, which is actually I think a worse record than the year before, and they missed the playoffs for the second year in a row. Cordell gets benched in Week 11 after the Tennessee game. After he got a safety for intentional grounding. I remember Steelers beating Carolina at home, and it kind of like snowed. And Travis Davis, returned like a long fumble. I don't know why I remember that game. Well, probably because what happened. This is a funny little story. Like the Fred Lane fumbled, the late Fred Lane. But I remember Mark Madden said it was like watching a team of Travis Davises trying to tackle Travis Davis because he was really bad at tackling. And also I was over a friend's house, and this guy, he was like, we were watching the Steeler game, and he kept turning off the Steeler game to watch ice skating, which was just odd. It was just odd.
That was the second to last game of the season, and so by that point they had lost. What was that? 6 in a row.
Yeah, it was a pretty meaningless game.
It was pretty meaningless. They were done at that point, and you're right. It was snowing. It was like right before Christmas or right after Christmas.
Yeah.
And man, people were so just fed up with the Steelers at that point.
Yeah. Tom Zach finished out the season, but doesn't really play that great, and it's obvious the Steelers need to find another quarterback. Stewart, this is probably his worst season as a quarterback. Only 1,464 yards passing, 6 touchdowns and 10 interceptions. Another year with more interceptions than touchdowns. He only has 2 rushing touchdowns and 4 fumbles. So once again, the turnovers are just way up there. Although, the passing yards are down. He didn't start the whole season. Like you said, Tom Zach finished out the year. So they go into the 2000 season, and we covered this in a podcast extensively. But this is the first time in Stewart, not the first, but one of the few times he's had a coordinator back-to-back. They keep Gilbride. The front office finally settled. Kevin Colbert is hired. Donahoe is let go. So that kind of stabilizes the team a little. And they switch strategies to like signing free agents instead of not signing free agents. Tom Zach's contract, he actually wasn't cut or anything. They just didn't renew his contract. And after that, I mean, Tom Zach was like, a 15, 16-year veteran. Yeah, so he just retired. He did play one more year with the Lions, but I think he got hurt either in the preseason. And
he never actually played for them. I think he signed with them and never actually played for them.
Yeah. And I don't know if he came back. Did he come back and retire a Steeler? Or maybe he came back and retired a Bear. He might have retired a Bear.
I don't remember.
Because he probably did, because he retired a Bear because he won a Super Bowl with them. But Cordell, he got benched to start the season, and he was removed from being a starter. There's kind of confusion, whether he's a receiver or a quarterback. He's kind of like, so not allowed in the quarterback's room. Is he a receiver? Like, he's kind of like in a bad place just on the team. They're not sure what they're going to do with him. The Steelers start the season 0-3. They lose to Cleveland on a really bad sack that Kent Graham takes. Once again, we covered that a little more in another podcast. But Cordell fills in for the injured, benched Kent Graham. I don't know. It was an injury/benching. Yeah. He was hurt, but like we've seen enough of Kent Graham.
Your knee hurts. No, actually, I'm okay. No, your knee hurts. Please,
are you too sure your knee hurts? Yeah. I think your knee hurts.
For the love of everybody, please don't play anymore.
Yeah. But Cordell kind of does respectable the next game. And he throws 1 interception, no touchdowns. But they only ask him to throw 16 passes. So they kind of go back to the formula of we're going to run the ball and just have Cordell kind of be game manager. So we kind of go into the game manager part of Cordell's career here. He ends up starting 11 games. Their defense is getting better, and Cordell just has to play his role. That game against the Raiders that year, one of the last games at Three River Stadium, he has a great game, picks up a fumble and runs for a big first down. They had some breaks go against them as a team, especially the Philly game where they had a call that didn't get called, that they lost. But unlike other years, is they actually finished the year on a winning note, going 9-7 and missing the playoffs. But they had finished the season strong instead of the other years where they had seemed to lose all the games at the end. Cordell had a much better year. 1,860 yards passing. He had 11 touchdowns and 8 interceptions with, 7 TDs. So he had 18 and 16. So he's actually ahead. The first time in a couple of years he's been ahead of the, and I think that's a big thing in a quarterback. It's almost like pitchers, it's strikeouts to walks. Quarterbacks, it's definitely touchdowns to turnovers if you're going to include the rushing stats.
And
in his case, I think, now, if you're asking about Tom Brady, who cares about Tom Brady or Dan Marino's rushing stats? Those guys, that isn't what they do. But for this type of quarterback, I think you have to include that.
Right. It's, like you said, Steve, we covered that episode extensively, or we covered that season extensively on another episode. But one thing that I think was shocking was, I don't know, a lot of people didn't really even expect Cordell to be like still with the team that season. Like everybody's like, okay, that's the end of the Cordell Stewart experiment. Let's move on. We signed Kent Graham. Nobody was real happy about that, but nobody thought, Cordell would be anywhere in the picture at all. And now he's like sort of back, not to the extent he had been 3 years earlier, but I think heading into that next season, he was sort of the presumed starter, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah. As you see, Kevin Gilbride did get fired. He actually did get fired at the end of the season. And they promoted a guy, Mike Mularkey, who's actually became a head coach and pretty successful, I think as an offensive coordinator, maybe more than a head coach. But he had been there like a tight ends coach or something like that. And they signed, in the offseason, they signed Tommy Maddox, the XFL MVP, and they drafted T. Martin over Tom Brady, the more infamous things that happened. Stewart is on now his 5th offensive coordinator in 6 seasons. Cordell starts the season really bad. He throws 2 interceptions and a loss to Jacksonville. Seems like when we open up against Jacksonville, we always lose. They have an unexpected bye week, and it kind of reset the season as 9/11 had happened. But then they got back on track versus Buffalo. They won 20-3. I remember the Week 11 game. They beat Tennessee, and Cordell had a pretty good game running and passing. And Tennessee had always been one of those teams we hadn't been able to beat in recent years. Right. And they won 34-24. And Cordell had a great game, 254 yards passing and 2 touchdowns. And he had a nice long 54-yard rushing. So one run was a 48-yard run, actually. But he had a nice game, rushing and passing. He has a great 90-yard pass to Bobby Shaw against Baltimore in Week 14 that kind of locked up the win. But once again, they kind of went back to this formula of run the ball. Even that Bobby Shaw was pretty obvious that Baltimore was selling out against the run, and they threw on an early down and caught Baltimore, in a bad defense. Week 16, he has a pretty bad performance, and the defense gets exposed. This is kind of like a precursor of what happens next season is Dick LeBeau's offensive coordinator figures out to just let John Kitna throw the ball a bunch, and they really did have a bad game. And I remember the field was really bad in Cincinnati. They didn't have turf yet. They tried to go with regular, grass, and everybody was falling all over the place. And they gave up a ton of points that game. But the Steelers had finished the season at 13-3. I think that was the best record by a Bill Cowher team to that point in his career. And it was the old strategy of strong defense and a running game. And they make the playoffs for the first time in 3 seasons. They haven't made the playoffs. And Stewart actually has a really successful year, and he makes his first Pro Bowl. And he gets voted team MVP. And this is probably, I would argue, his best year as a pro. He has 3,109 yards passing. He has 14 touchdowns. He still throws 11 interceptions, but he has 5 touchdowns, so he's 19, and he does have 11 fumbles. But that was probably, even though his turnovers are a little high, I think that was definitely his best year of his career, just due to the passing yards and even the passing TDs.
He actually finished 4th in the league MVP voting that year.
Yeah,
it was Kurt Warner and Marshall Faulk.
But he made a Pro Bowl too. Yeah,
and it was Kurt Warner, Marshall Faulk, Brett Favre, and then Cordell finished 4th in the MVP voting. So he actually got votes for not only the MVP of the Steelers, the MVP of the entire league. That's how good of a season he had that year.
Yeah, and I remember they had home field advantage of the playoffs. And they get a bye, and then in a big game against the rival Ravens, I remember Bettis had been kind of hurt the last half of that season, and they tried to give him an injection, and it got all messed up, so they had to start Zaraway. But it was no problem because Dan Kreider crushed Ray Lewis, and I'm sure a Ray Lewis highlight they'll show, when he goes into the Hall of Fame. When he got blocked from, a guy from New Hampshire blocked him. But, they just totally, they beat the Ravens pretty convincingly, but the Ravens had Elvis Gerbach as their quarterback, so they really didn't have a good quarterback. So, and Cordell didn't have to do much. So the next week they play the Patriots in the championship game, and I remember I've watched this game painfully as much a couple times before. Even in the interviews, Charlie Weiss said, we're going to throw the ball 50 times. Against, so they had watched the Cincinnati game, and that was their strategy, and they had Brady. And the only reason they ended up not doing that is because Brady got hurt early in the game. Lee Flowers tackled him, and his ankle got hurt. So the Steelers actually got a really big break there because if they would have thrown, they probably would have scored 30 or 40 points. But Stewart has an absolutely horrendous game. He throws 3 interceptions. He lost 2 fumbles. Yeah, the special teams gave up a touchdown, but he threw 2 interceptions with the game on the line. And this is once again, late in the game, they're playing the same defense they've been playing, and he just couldn't be accurate or see the field well enough to complete enough passes to win the game. And it was just, that was the game where I knew, like, I was always a big Cordell fan and, like, kind of like, Cordell defender I fought. In that game, I was like, there's no defending. This guy's not a good NFL quarterback. He's mediocre at best, and you're not going to win a Super Bowl with this guy. I knew at that point they were not going to win a Super Bowl with him at quarterback. So the Patriots said after the game they played one type of defense the whole game. So, and that's kind of on Cordell. You got to be able to make an adjustment, and but that was his limitations, I guess.
It was such a tough game because, like like you said, the special teams. That was a huge part of it. And the special teams was horrible that season, and the Steelers give up a punt return and they have a field goal blocked for a touchdown. So they give up 2 touchdowns. 2 of the 3 Patriots touchdowns came on special teams, which is unbelievable. Yeah. But that all had happened by like the middle of the third quarter.
Yeah, they still had a chance to tie the game.
And by the beginning of the fourth quarter, by the beginning of the fourth quarter, it's 20. They had scored touchdowns. It was 21-17. So Cordell had the entire fourth quarter to score once and take the lead. And
it was bad interception. It wasn't unlucky. Right. It was just he threw it right to the guy. Right. It was ugly. It wasn't like anybody. They caught the ball, which I guess is making a play, but it was like one of those ones where he just threw it right to the guy.
So we talked. We when our Super Bowl 30 episode that we did, we talked about Neil O'Donnell really just wasn't a winner, And there's some quarterbacks that are winners and some quarterbacks that aren't. And I don't know, Cordell, like, think about any other situation. Think about the Super Bowl against the Cardinals when Kurt Warner throws the interception to James Harrison. Does he fold, or does he come back and give them the lead later?
Yeah.
Right. Think about the Kansas City in the Super Bowl against San Francisco. They're down. Mahomes is playing a terrible game. Does he fold, or does he come back and take the lead? I mean, that's what they needed from Cordell, and like you said, Steve, he just couldn't do it.
No, he was a game. Yeah, we'll get into that. So going into 2002, for some reason, like, Cowher still believes in Cordell. I guess they really don't have anybody they believe in on the roster.
Well, they were 13-3. I mean, they weren't going to make a change at quarterback after going 13-3. And I
guess winning covers up a lot of faults. It covered up the defense being not able to stop the pass. In 2002, we kind of covered in one of our earlier podcasts. It was the Tommy Maddox season. Cordell is still the starter. They lose the first 2 games, and basically the Patriots and the Raiders do what the Bengals did the year before and what they had wanted to do in the championship game, and they just pass the ball, and Cordell the offense can't get going, and they need more offense because the defense just can't stop the pass. Cordell's throwing a lot of interceptions. The last straw and this was really the end of Cordell's career in Pittsburgh, was, at least as a starter, at 0-2, losing to Cleveland, who really wasn't that good. Cordell throws into double coverage, and he gets benched, and the Cordell Stewart basically is over, and Tommy Maddox comes in and saves the game and the season. I guess Cleveland wasn't horrible. They would make the playoffs that year, but still, like you say, Cordell just, he did start 2 games against Cincinnati and Jacksonville, which they both won.
When Maddox was hurt.
Yeah. So he did kind of right the ship a little bit. But once again, I think it was more game manager stuff. The aftermath was Stewart, I didn't know if he got cut or released, or they just let him go. He went to the Bears, and he started a couple games before being benched for Chris Chandler. And then he came back, and they benched him again for Rich Grossman. And then he never started another game at quarterback in the NFL. He signed with Baltimore in 2004. He had to punt one game against the Jets because the Baltimore's punter got hurt. And he actually got Special Teams Player of the Week for his efforts. So 2005, he was back up. He played in one game. and he was out of the league the next year. He got cut by the Ravens. So 2005 was probably the official end of his career. From 2001, I guess that was 4 years. He still hung around as a backup for a couple more years. In 2012, Stewart came back to the Steelers, a nice end to his career. He signed with the Steelers for one day to do the official retire. He retired as a Pittsburgh Steeler. So, and his quote was, "That's where it all started. That's where my success was, and this is some closure that I wanted to have and I needed to have with my career." So, after all the tough feelings and stuff, and we'll get into that more, what Kordell kind of made up with the fans. And I think the fans I still like Kordell. And I think he has his place in Steeler history. And he was definitely better than some, but not as good as others. And, that's just kind of where he fit in. So legacy, what went wrong? There's kind of standard reasons that when I was researching, like there's the standard, and I kind of remember that. Like the first one is he had too many offensive coordinators in his 8-year career. He had 6 different coordinators. By comparison, Ben has only had 4 in a 15-year career. So you could say Kordell had to learn a new offense every year. I don't know. A lot of other quarterbacks have had to do that. Randall Cunningham had to do it at the end of his career and had a great year. So I don't quite buy that. There is something to continuity, but if you're a good quarterback, I think you can adjust. The Steelers, kind of in his prime years, after the '98 season to 2001, like they were in this transition with the front office, and the team was going from the Super Bowl years to the next generation. And like I said, it took a couple years for that talent and with the front office finally being settled. So, yeah, you could say that, but great quarterbacks have been able to cover up for that. Like Marino, covered for Don Shula and the Dolphins being an absolute garbage organization for how many years. And Ben's even carried the Steelers through years where they've had to rebuild.
Yeah.
So, if you have a great quarterback, you can kind of overcome that.
That's a good point. The Steelers went from the 2000s team that had made 3 Super Bowls to some 8-8 teams, and then they sort of rebounded and rebuilt with new players. Yeah. But like you said, it took 2 or 3 seasons to get back there.
But it's like they probably, if it wasn't for Ben, they probably win like 4 or 5 games that year. Yeah. Right. Yeah, and we can compare to other quarterbacks like we were doing earlier. I picked Donovan McNabb, who really maybe isn't the greatest, but he played at the same time. That's kind of why I picked him, because the rules were similar still. But he did have Andy Reid, who's considered a very good coordinator and kind of, very creative on offense. I didn't realize Donovan McNabb had this good of an NFL career. He had 37,000 yards passing, 234 touchdowns, and only 117 interceptions, which isn't 3-1, but I think that's pretty solid.
Yeah.
Andy had 28 rushing touchdowns, which I don't know, which as we'll compare. Michael Vick was another guy we'd mentioned. He actually had 22,000 passing yards and 133 touchdowns with 88 interceptions. He did, I think Vic kind of falls into he threw probably a little too many interceptions, but he actually had 36 rushing touchdowns, which is kind of surprising that he didn't have more than McNabb, because I think Michael Vick was a much better, threat as a running quarterback. And he's probably the greatest dual threat quarterback of all time. If you want to look all time, if you look at the stats, and I don't know, it's tough to say, but I guess Fran Tarkenton, who has 47,000 yards passing and 342 touchdowns passing and 32 rushing touchdowns. So I guess Fran Tarkenton is probably a little better than Vic, at least passing-wise, and he had his, pretty comparable rushing stats as Vic. Steve Young, too, people forget. Like Steve Young early in his career was more of a running threat, and he has 33,000 pass yards and 232 touchdowns. And 43 rushing touchdowns. So actually, Steve Young has more rushing touchdowns for his career than Michael Vick, which is odd.
Well, some of it's on longevity too. Michael Vick also had
missed a couple years and then wasn't. I guess San Francisco at the end wasn't the greatest team.
No, but Steve Young didn't go to prison for a bunch of years in the middle of his career.
Well, he did go to Tampa Bay for a while, and that's kind of like prison.
Well, and he was the backup to Joe Montana. So yeah, you're right. everybody had different circumstances, but I think all four of the guys you mentioned, I don't think you can argue that they all didn't have really good success. I mean, a couple of those guys are in the Hall of Fame. I don't know if McNabb or Vic will ever be, but
I don't see why not with McNabb. Like, I just that really, like, when I looked at him, I never thought much. I always thought he was kind of overrated. And I looked at his stats. I was like, well, I guess losing all those championship games and not winning,
right.
not doing great in the Super Bowl, not getting like there. Like, everybody always criticizes, now is it him or the coach for not running the hurry up in that Super Bowl against the Patriots?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think if he wins
just one
Super Bowl, I think he maybe has a different narrative to his career. But all four of those guys definitely were similar quarterbacks, and I think you could definitely say they all had way more long-term success than Cordell had.
Yeah.
If you stack up Cordell's '97 season or 2001 season against any of those guys, it looks really good. But if you take all the stuff in between, it's not so good.
Yeah, and we'll get in. I also put in some of the Steelers all time. Roethlisberger, as of right now, has 56,000 yards passing and 363 touchdowns and 191 interceptions. I don't know what his rushing touchdowns is. I don't really care because he's not a running quarterback. Terry Bradshaw had, by comparison, 226,000 yards passing. And Terry's kind of weird, like 212 touchdowns but 210 interceptions. Terry's another one that threw too many interceptions. Because, like, you look at Ben, that's almost 2.5, 3 to 1. Like, Ben's, like, right where you should be. Whereas Terry's, like, that's 200 interceptions. That's too many, for me. But he won 4 Super Bowls, and when it counted in the big games, Terry was clutch, man. You can't.
Right. Sometimes it's not always the stats. Yeah.
It's when you throw them, too. Neil O'Donnell, speaking of when you throw your interceptions, great lead in there. In his 5 years, he had 12,000, and this is just with the Steelers. I didn't do his career stats. He did 12,000 passing yards, 68 touchdowns, and 39 interceptions. Pretty low in the interceptions, but he would definitely take a sack. He definitely was not in any way, shape, form could be confused with being mobile at all. Maybe.
Or being a gunslinger and just throwing the ball anywhere, except in the biggest game of his life.
Yeah. Now, Cordell's stats were 14,000 passing yards. He had 77 touchdowns passing, but he had 84 interceptions. So he threw more interceptions than touchdowns, and he did rush for 28 touchdowns. So, I mean, if you throw in the rushing touchdowns, he does then kind of go above his turn. I didn't look up his fumbles, but yeah, I mean...
Yeah,
it's tough to say, like, and I would say this, like, another reason maybe, racism, was people and rumors, like Cordell's, there was always rumors about his sexuality. Was that just like stealth racism? You didn't want to sound like a racist, so you would say, oh, he's, whatever, the people would call him gay, and it was always, oh, my second brother's cousin saw him do this or that, and it was always like stupid rumors.
Well, and it's hard, and you have it in the notes here. Like, it's tough to read people's minds. Like, you don't know where their motivation's always coming from. But some of the stuff that was directed at Cordell was just so vicious and angry, and I don't know. People, we were too young to remember the anger that was directed at Bradshaw. But a lot of people really hated Bradshaw, too, for a while.
Well, people didn't like O'Donnell, but it was never to that level. It was just like, oh, he threw those interceptions, which I can understand. That's a fan, and,
Yeah, well,
I think that's more of a fair criticism than this. This is just like, somebody just made this up.
And O'Donnell...
literally, somebody just made this up.
And O'Donnell's career arc with the Steelers wasn't the same as any of those other guys. Like, O'Donnell sort of, like, was a game manager, and then he, like, progressively got better every season until... he threw those interceptions in the Super Bowl, then he didn't stick around long enough to... Yeah. He left after that. So I don't know if there was a whole arc there. I mean, Ben's had a couple ups and downs in his career, and there's been viciousness thrown his way. But, boy, Cordell...
Well, I think Ben's, though, like, it isn't like stuff... people made stuff out of Hulk. Although, I've heard, like, weird rumors about Ben, too. Like,
yeah, but the Cordell thing was much more prominent. And like you said, everybody was sure because they had a source inside the...
Whereas, like, Ben, it's like, you can't, Ben, like, the couple incidences, there's been some couple well-publicized incidents. Then there's been some other rumored incidents.
Right.
But it's like, well, if these other incidents, and that definitely happened, could have this, I don't know.
The rumors about his sexuality seemed to start when he cried on the sidelines.
Yes.
Which seemed like almost too convenient. Like, well, he's crying on the sidelines, so that means he's not a real man. Or who knows where that came from? But it is hard to ignore race when you think about just like I said, the viciousness of some of the things that were said about him. And like you said, who knows what people are really thinking? But boy, it's hard to not at least factor that in.
And Bill Cowher went through it too. Cordell wasn't the only person that this was directed at. Kay Cowher, his late wife, actually addressed it. And we'll post that quote up on the website from Kay about that. And here's an ironic thing. In October 2017, Cordell actually won a $3 million default judgment in Atlanta against a YouTuber. I guess it was some guy on the internet named Andrew Caldwell, who claimed he had sexual encounter with Stewart, and Stewart had given him expensive gifts. Stewart denied these claims. Caldwell later recanted the claim and denied that it had ever happened. And Cordell actually got a judgment against this guy for $3 million in court. So, I mean, it just, I don't know why it just keeps dogging him like this, and like people just making it up, obviously. And it literally lost a court case. You've lost $3 million over this. I hope it was worth getting your 5 minutes of fame on YouTube.
Yeah.
And that was after 2017. He hadn't played football in 5 years.
I know, you're not even, who would even care at that point? I don't know. It was just, you're right, it was a lot of anger. People were angry at Cowher. Then there was people that said Cowher had an affair
with the secretary, and that's what the Kay Cowher quotes are about.
Well, I had also, the other rumor was that Cowher was sleeping with Cordell's sister or something. That's why
I never heard that.
That's why he kept starting him, was because.
Oh, geez.
Again, so many ridiculous rumors, but it only took one season. Like usually, you'd think it would take a whole bunch of bad seasons. He was in the AFC Championship game in '97, and by like the next calendar year, he was in all these terrible off the field situations and hated. I mean, the town really, really turned on him quick.
Yeah, which was unfortunate.
It was.
And it wasn't over just like play on the field either. It was just like these stupid little, like just made up rumors. That's unfair. That's unfair to him. It was unfair to him. It really was.
And like you said, there was other things happening with the team at that time. I think people got so used to the early success of the Cowher teams and expected to be in the playoffs every year. And it wasn't just Cordell. It was a lot of other things happening with the front office and everything else that you mentioned. So it wasn't all his fault. Certainly, it was a bunch of his fault, but it wasn't all his fault.
Yeah, and in my opinion, I think I kind of compare Cordell to like Tim Tebow. He's like a decent quarterback in a certain type of offense, but he just wasn't like a good enough at that position to really carry you to a championship. Stewart's bigger problems were he had a strong arm, but he wasn't accurate, and for some reason he didn't see the field well, I don't think. Mm-hmm. Like, I think that's why he had so much trouble against reading the defense. Kevin Gilbride, I remember this interview, said to him that the receivers could be the eyes of the offense. So in Gilbride's system, the receiver would have like two different routes, like go inside or outside, and depending on where the defender would stand. Even Tom Brady said that if you read it, I look at the defense, not what the receiver's doing. Well, Cordell could never quite comprehend that or just wasn't skilled at that. So he just never could understand how that could work. Well, I think that's more in Cordell because apparently Warren Moon and all the other quarterbacks, Eli Manning, Kevin Gilbride went on to win 2 Super Bowls. Eli Manning could figure it out. Warren Moon could figure it out,
Good point.
Yeah. I think, too, like Tim Tebow, like I always thought should have been a tight end. I think if Tim Tebow doesn't stick the quarterback, switches the tight end, he's Rob Gronkowski before Rob Gronkowski, and he probably makes the Hall of Fame as a tight end. Cordell had way too many turnovers as a quarterback, just threw too many interceptions, and that's a sign of a bad to mediocre quarterback. The rules were different. You could hit receivers and quarterbacks a lot more. That's why I didn't really compare him to like Lamar Jackson or Cam Newton because I don't know if you can.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, that's fair because you're right. It's a different.
Lamar Jackson would probably be a closer analog, because they kind of ran, but they ran like that like spread, and they didn't run the spread offense back then. Like, would Cordell like have done well? And I kind of cover that later. He's such a different quarterback than Bradshaw. Him and O'Donnell, and Bradshaw and Roethlisberger, we'll kind of rank them later. Cordell got lots of media hype, so I think that raised fans' expectations. And that probably, unfairly led to him. When people build you up, they love to tear you down. So that kind of happened to him. And Cordell and quarterbacks in general always get blamed for everything. They're like the goalie in hockey. Whether you win or lose, you always get more credit or more blame than you probably should either way.
That's a really good point, Steve.
Yeah.
And this was also like an era where you had like the freak athletes like Bo Jackson. Remember how big Bo Jackson was for a while? Like he was in every commercial. Kids, we all bought every Bo Jackson whatever he endorsed. And I think Cordell, like right out of the gate, they put him in that same category. Like he mentioned all the commercials and everything.
Yeah.
And so like you said, putting him on that pedestal and then watching him start faltering, it's like you said, it's the higher up you go, the harder the fall.
Yeah. Cordell was benched no less than 3 different times in his career. That can't be fun to go through. Maybe, like I said, with all the rule changes and the new offenses, like I couldn't imagine him playing in like an Andy Reid offense. I wonder how like that would have worked out for him. Like the offense that like Kansas City or like Philadelphia ran. Like, yeah, I mean, maybe he has the career McNabb ended up having.
That's a good point too. You talked about the game manager style that Cowher had. I mean, that Cowher was not that offense that they had in '97. That was out of the box for Cowher because he liked.
Well, I think Chan Gailey was probably their best offensive coordinator that knew how to use him, and that because Mularkey I think ended up being a good coordinator, and he got a lot out of Cordell, but. I think Chan Gailey was maybe a little bit of an edge.
And you wonder what would happen if Gailey had stuck around.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I mean, Gailey had success in Dallas, and then Jerry Jones just, if you don't win a Super Bowl every year,
right? Or maybe Cordell just becomes Cordell.
Yeah, and gets some fire.
Yeah.
Like I said, he was kind of a good quarterback, not a great one. Teams used to win with this formula. Like before that, like the Mark Rippons, Trent Dilfer, Brad Johnson, Jess Haas, Stetler, like all those like game manager types. But by the end of the 90s, I think that had kind of started like, although Trent Dilfer was 2000, they kind of started to move away from that. You were going to more, you needed like a competent, like even Nick Foles, it was really like the last journeyman. He put up great numbers in the playoffs and the Super Bowl. And it's kind of like, I think Nick Foles is more like a Jim Plunkett, like who had like that a couple good years after he bounced around for a while.
You can win a Super Bowl without a quarterback, but it's for sure the exception in the Super Bowl.
Yeah. Here you go. I don't know if you agree or disagree with this. I would still rate Cordell as one of the top 5 quarterbacks in Steeler history. And my top 5 would be Ben. I think Ben's I know Bradshaw has 2 more Super Bowls, but I think Ben has the better, just those fewer interceptions. And maybe just, I don't know. I think Ben's a little better than Bradshaw. Bradshaw's number 2 for sure. Bobby Lane's number 3 because he's a Hall of Famer and he's Bobby Lane. He was pretty good. I'm going to give Neil O'Donnell the slight edge over Stewart just because he went to a Super Bowl and Stewart could never get his teams to a Super Bowl. But that puts Stewart at 5. And would you change your new buddy, put Bradshaw over? I know people have to put Bradshaw over Roethlisberger. That's not really the argument. Would you put Stewart any higher on that list since we're talking about Cordell?
I think that's a good place for him. I'm not sure. I mean, I hate to say this, but I don't know who else you would put ahead of Stewart. Like after
Mark
5,
Malone.
There's a pretty steep drop off after Cordell. I mean, Tommy Maddox had that one really good season.
Even in that season, Tommy Maddox really only had like 5 good games.
Yeah, right. Bobby Brister had a few good games.
Tom Zach?
Yeah. But no, I'd put Cordell there. I mean, he almost won the league MVP once. He had two seasons where he led the team to the AFC Championship game and a couple of Pro Bowl appearances. Like I think he belongs in the top 5 for sure. And like you said, it's a mixed bag for him.
He is it's a mixed, I think that's his biggest legacy is it's mixed. And I think people have come around and like, as, as the years go by, that's why they wait 5 years to put people in the Hall of Fame, because it gives you more perspective as you get a couple years on his career. And his perspective is he was a good quarterback, and he got him the AFC Championship game, but that's where his limitations, like the defenses get pretty good in the championship round in the Super Bowl, and that's where he kind of topped out at for whatever reason,
Yeah, and he didn't have that clutch.
No,
whatever it
not in the playoffs. Not in
Right.
the playoffs, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd put him in the top 5, and I think, like you said, years later, I think we can look back and remember there was good, there was bad, but there was also good. I think
He was a lot of fun to watch.
he was a
was
lot of fun to
entertaining,
watch.
yeah.
And again, Pittsburgh, we hadn't really had a good quarterback for years and years, and for a while, he was one of the best quarterbacks in the league. It was very short lived, but it was exciting at the time, and it's a shame that it didn't work out better for him and for the Steelers.
I mean, I guess it's hard to believe he only made one Pro Bowl, but I mean, that was only that one season. And it was such a weird one-off season like that 2001. Like, it just kind of came out of nowhere. Like, nobody expected Cordell to have that great of a season that year.
Right.
And, I just remember on ESPN, they he sold his soul to like Mephistopheles or something for the, made some deal with the devil to.
Well, and amazingly, by the third game of the next season, he's benched again.
Yeah. As
So-
quickly as it happened, it was over. Yeah. For him.
Isn't that? I mean,
Yeah.
it's just amazing. He goes from top of the world to bench to top of the world to bench to on the Bears at that point. But it's like, man, I can't think of any other quarterback, even on another team, that had that kind of career trajectory. Where they were just that good, and then a backup, and then that good, and just all with the same team too. You
Yeah.
see other quarterbacks maybe rejuvenate their careers later with some other team, but it was a really wild, crazy ride for him. But it was fun it was definitely fun while he was playing good. That's for sure.
Yeah, I like I said, I was always a Cordell fan, and but I think time gives you perspective, and he was a good player, but not a great player. I wish they could have pulled out a Super Bowl, but then maybe we would overrate him a little. I don't know, but I don't know. The time always gives you a little better perspective. If you agree or disagree with us, feel free to visit us on Twitter or Facebook, and at our website, which is Tim.
PittsburghSportsMemories.weebly.com.
There you go. And I mean, I'm sure this is a pretty good controversial subject, and it's Cordell always starts the conversation good. But thanks for tuning in, and please feel free to comment on one of our platforms.
And please, if you can, give us a rating on the podcast. That helps people find us. So please do that if you like what you hear.